Illinois Route 53 in Lyle on a February morning. A state truck goes past with its spreader turning, throwing rock salt in a wide arc across both lanes, and the spray lifts off the pavement and drifts east into the tree line. That tree line is no ordinary roadside scrub. It is the edge of the Morton Arboretum, 1,700 acres of collected trees, and a little further along the shoulder there is a gate into it. The men who planted what is behind that gate are long dead. I have come back to this stretch of road more often than I can properly explain because of who owns both sides of it. The trees were planted by Joy Morton, who built the largest salt company in the United States. The salt on the road is his company's business, or what became of it, and inside the tree line, along the boundary where the highway runs, the Arboretum's own scientists have spent decades measuring what the de-icing salt is doing to the collection. One family's two legacies, working against each other across 40 feet of shoulder. Consider a few things before we go any further. The man who founded this company was the son of the man who created Arbor Day, and the same family produced a Secretary of Agriculture and a Secretary of the Navy. He bought his way into the salt trade with a reported $10,000, and he had left school at 15. The girl with the umbrella has never been a real person. The company says so plainly. She has been redrawn at least 5 times, and the artist who first drew her is not recorded by name anywhere in the surviving record. In 1924, with no law requiring it, this company began putting iodine in its salt, and childhood goiter in one surveyed Michigan population fell from 38.6% to 1.4% inside a generation. Then in 1948, the Supreme Court of the United States used this company to write a rule about pricing that antitrust lawyers still cite by name today. For 7 years, the name Morton was on the solid rocket boosters of the American Space Shuttle program. It was on them on the 28th of January, 1986. The company has since been sold to a drug maker, then a rocket manufacturer, then a chemical firm, then a German fertilizer conglomerate, and then a private investment company. And the last member of the family to run it died in 1961, with no record of a single Morton in its leadership since. All of that is in the public record. None of it is the strangest part. This is the story of a family that took the plainest substance on earth and built it into a name so familiar that a girl with an umbrella has stood on American kitchen tables for more than a century. It is also the story of how that same family arranged, whether by intention or by simple neglect, to leave behind everything except ownership, so that the name outlived them entirely while they let go of the company, the control, and the fortune. And what they finally left standing on the ground in Illinois is now being slowly poisoned by the product that paid for it. I want to start at the roadside because the roadside is where both halves of the family's work are visible at the same time. Before we walk in, one small thing. Subscribing helps build a small audience around work like this and rewards the hours that go into it. Chapter 1. The Salt on the Trees. The Morton Arboretum sits at 4,100 Illinois Route 53 in Lyle, about 25 miles west of the Chicago Loop. It covers 1,700 acres. There are 16 miles of trails through it, and something on the order of 222,000 cataloged plants, representing roughly 4,100 kinds of trees, which makes it not a park but a museum, with the collection alive and rooted in the ground rather than hung on a wall. People come to walk in it. School children come to look at oaks that were standing before any of them were born. Interstate 88 runs directly along it, and Route 53 runs past its gate, and both of those roads are salted every winter. The scale of the salting is not small. Figures published in the arboricultural literature put the Illinois State Toll Highway Authority's application along the stretch of Interstate 88 at the Arboretum at roughly 370 tons per lane mile across a winter, which works out to over 2,000 tons per mile of 6-lane expressway. Some of that stays on the pavement and runs off into the drains. Some of it is thrown into the air by traffic as fine spray and lands on bark and buds and evergreen needles. Some of it soaks down through the shoulder into the soil, where it changes the chemistry of the root zone and interferes with the way a tree takes up water. The damage is worst within about 60 feet of the pavement. Sensitive plants can show injury considerably further out. What the injury looks like on the ground is not dramatic, which is part of why it took scientists to establish it. An evergreen takes the spray on the side facing the road, and the needles brown on that side and stay green on the other. So the tree appears to have been scorched by something passing. A deciduous tree shows it later and more slowly, in leaves that come out small, or come out scorched at the margins, or come out and drop early. Twigs die back, growth stalls. The tree holds on. It can be dying for years. To anyone driving past at 60 miles an hour, it looks entirely ordinary. The Arboretum knows all of this in detail, because the Arboretum studied it. Its researchers published a case study on de-icing salt deposition across their own grounds, and a paper on woody plants and roadway salt that framed the problem accurately as a dilemma of the modern city. The institution founded by a salt fortune has spent years producing the scientific literature on what road salt does to trees, and maintains a public guide to which species can survive it. I want to sit with that for a moment because it is the sort of thing that sounds invented and is not. A man made a fortune selling salt. He spent a great deal of that fortune buying farmland outside Chicago and planting it with trees from all over the temperate world. He gave the land away. A century later, one of the two largest uses of American salt is keeping winter roads passable. The highway network has grown up around the trees he planted, and the institution carrying his name now has staff whose work includes measuring the harm. Neither side of that road is doing anything wrong. The salt is on the road because people would otherwise die on it. The trees are there because a man in the 1890s thought the prairie needed them. The two things simply cannot both be had in full. By the standards of industrial legacies, this is an unusually literal one. Most family fortunes leave behind a foundation, a wing of a museum, a name over a door. This one left behind a physical argument, conducted continuously, in public, on either side of a state highway. And the name that sits over the gate, and the name on the paper sacks of de-icing salt going out to municipal garages across the Midwest, is the same name. It belongs, in any meaningful sense, to neither of them now. The company has not been run by a Morton since before the Kennedy administration. The Arboretum has not had a Morton at the head of its board since 1977. To understand how a family ends up in that position, present on both sides of a road and absent from both, you have to go back to Nebraska, to a treeless stretch of prairie, and to a newspaper editor who believed the plains had been handed to him unfinished. Chapter 2. The Nebraska Newspaper Man. Julius Sterling Morton was born on the 22nd of April, 1832, in Adams, New York, and moved west as a young married man to the Nebraska Territory, where he edited the Nebraska City News, involved himself in territorial politics, served as territorial secretary and acting governor, and eventually, under Grover Cleveland, became Secretary of Agriculture of the United States. He is not remembered for any of that. He is remembered because of trees. The Nebraska he arrived in was grassland. Settlers coming onto it found almost nothing standing, which meant no lumber, No fuel, no windbreaks, no shade, and no fruit. Morton, who had come from the wooded country of upstate New York and who gardened seriously, spent years arguing in print that the settlers ought to be planting. Not for sentiment, for the practical reason that a farm without trees on the open plain was a harder and poorer farm. He kept at it, and in 1872 he proposed to the State Board of Agriculture a single day set aside for the purpose. The first Arbor Day was held on the 10th of April, 1872. Accounts of that day report more than 1 million trees planted across Nebraska. The state made it annual in 1874. Other states took it up through the following decades. Schools attached themselves to it, and it spread eventually well beyond the country. It is one of the few American holidays that consists entirely of doing a chore. There is no meal, no gift, no parade in most places. The observance is that you go outside and put a tree in the ground, and the reward arrives 20 years later for somebody else. His wife was Caroline Joy French Morton, an artist and a gardener, and by the account that has come down, she was the one who decided what the sons would be called. She wanted names of one syllable, on the reasoning that a short name cannot be shortened further and so cannot be turned into a nickname. So the boys were Joy, Paul, Mark, and Carl. 4 names, 4 syllables between them. No nicknames available. The eldest carried his mother's maiden middle name as his given name, which is why the founder of the largest salt company in America went through life called Joy. The house those children grew up in still stands in Nebraska City, and it is worth knowing what happened to it, because it sets the family pattern early. It began as a modest frame house on a treeless tract outside Nebraska City and was enlarged over decades into a 52-room mansion with a columned front surrounded by planted grounds. It was called Arbor Lodge. It was the seat of the family in every sense that mattered, the place the Secretary of Agriculture came home to. And in 1923, the eldest son handed it, with roughly 60 acres around it, to the state of Nebraska. It is a public park today. Strangers walk through the rooms. What that household produced is worth stating plainly, because it explains the shape of everything that follows. Paul Morton became Secretary of the Navy under Theodore Roosevelt, and afterward President of the Equitable Life Assurance Society. Mark Morton became his brother's business partner and a vice president of the salt company. Carl Morton ran a starch works and died young of pneumonia in 1901. And Joy Morton built the salt business. One family, inside 2 generations, put a man in the cabinet twice, in 2 different departments, under 2 different presidents, and cornered a national commodity. The thing I keep returning to is the founding assumption of the household, which was that you improve ground you will not personally live to see mature. A tree is precisely that kind of object. You plant an oak, and the oak is a favor to somebody who has not been born yet, and the person who dug the hole gets shade for a few years at the end if they are lucky. J. Sterling Morton built a public holiday on that premise and then spent his career arguing for it in a newspaper. A family raised inside that idea will produce men who are very good at building things. It will not necessarily produce men who are good at holding on to them. Those are different instincts, and the second one is the one this family never seems to have developed. Sterling Morton died on the 27th of April, 1902, at the home of one of his sons in Lake Forest, Illinois. Accounts differ over which son it was. By then, his eldest had already been in the salt business for over 20 years, having gone into it at 25 with borrowed confidence and, by the accounts that survive, about $10,000. If you have read this far, you already know whether this is your sort of story. If it is, subscribing is the simplest way to keep them coming, and it costs you nothing. Chapter 3. $10,000. In 1848, a man named Alonzo Richmond set up a small agency in Chicago to sell salt shipped in from the Onondaga brine fields near Syracuse, New York. That agency, through a chain of successions, is the ultimate corporate ancestor of the Morton Salt Company. It is worth noting where the salt was coming from, because it explains why Chicago mattered. The salt moved west along the Erie Canal and down the Great Lakes, and Chicago was where it was broken up and sent onward into a continent that needed it badly. The reason it needed it badly was meat. Before mechanical refrigeration, salt was how you kept protein from spoiling, and Chicago in the second half of the 19th century was becoming the place where the country's animals were turned into food. The stockyards at their height are commonly cited as handling the great majority of the domestic meat supply. Every barrel of that trade required salt. A man who controlled the flow of salt into Chicago was standing at a very useful place in the American economy. Joy Morton had left school at 15. He had worked in banking and in railroads, and by his mid-20s, he was looking for a business of his own. Around 1879 or 1880, at the age of 25, he put a reported $10,000 into a partnership with a veteran salt man named Ezra Wheeler, whose firm carried his own name. Sources differ slightly on the exact year, and I would not stake anything on the precise figure, but the shape of it is consistent everywhere it appears. He bought a share of a going concern rather than starting one. Wheeler died in 1885. The firm became Joy Morton and Company, with Mark Morton as vice president, and by the following year, the eldest brother had it entirely. In 1889, he acquired Richmond and Company, the old agency, and with it, the distribution business that had been running Chicago salt for 40 years. It is worth being concrete about where the salt itself came from, because the word covers two entirely different industries. Some of it was evaporated from brine, which meant pumping saturated water out of the ground and boiling or drying it until what remained was crystal. Some of it was mined, which meant sending men underground into beds of rock salt laid down by seas that dried up before there were animals to swim in them, and blasting it out in rooms and pillars the way coal is taken. Morton eventually operated both kinds across the continent, including a mine at Grand Saline in Texas that sits above a salt dome running thousands of feet deep, and another at Fairport Harbor in Ohio that reaches roughly 2,000 feet down and then out underneath Lake Erie. The salt in a kitchen shaker and the salt on a January highway come out of the same ground by the same violence. Here is where the story stops being about a young man with a lucky purchase and becomes about a specific commercial idea. Salt is a commodity in the strictest sense. Sodium chloride from one producer is chemically indistinguishable from sodium chloride from any other. There is no such thing as a better grade of it in the way there is a better grade of wheat or steel. A man who merely brokers a commodity is at the mercy of everyone who makes it and everyone who ships it. So Morton stopped being at their mercy. He bought lake boats and moved his own salt. He went after the deposits themselves so that the company produced rather than purchased. He opened works in Kansas by 1898. The business was incorporated as the Morton Salt Company in 1910. What he had assembled by then was a superior position rather than a superior product, because a superior product was not available to anyone. He owned the mine, he owned the boat, he owned the warehouse. Every competitor had to rent at least one of those from somebody. That is the genuinely impressive piece of the whole arrangement. And it is also the piece that made everything afterward possible, including the parts the family had no control over. A business built on position rather than on invention is extraordinarily durable. It throws off dependable money in good years and bad. It also, eventually, becomes exactly the sort of asset that other people want to buy. But dependable was not the same as visible. Salt sat in barrels and bins. The grocer scooped it. Nobody asked whose it was because there was no reason to. Morton had solved the problem of controlling the supply and had not yet solved the problem that mattered more, which was that no one on Earth had ever had a reason to care about the brand of their salt. Chapter 4. The Girl in the Rain. The problem with salt in a humid climate is that it takes up water out of the air and cakes into a solid mass in the box. Households of the period knew this well. You put a few grains of rice in the shaker, or you broke the lumps up with a knife, and you accepted it because that was simply what salt did in August. In 1911, the company began adding an anti-caking agent, magnesium carbonate, and sold the result as free-running salt. It poured in damp weather. That was a genuine improvement, and improvements of that sort are only worth what you can explain to a shopper. 3 years later, the company introduced the round blue package, and, with the advertising agency N.W. Ayer and Son of Philadelphia, the campaign that carried it. The image was a small girl in a yellow raincoat, walking under an umbrella with her salt container tipped under her arm, the salt spilling out behind her in a line. The line beneath her said that when it rains, it pours. The package deserves as much attention as the picture on it. Until this point, salt largely reached the household, loose, out of a barrel or a bin, weighed out by a grocer who had no particular reason to tell a customer where it came from, and often could not have said. A sealed, round container with a spout changes the transaction completely. The salt inside it is now traceable to a company, which means the company can be blamed for a bad batch and credited for a good one, and the customer can ask for it again by name. A brand on a commodity is a promise that the thing inside will behave the same way every time. Morton had spent 30 years making sure it could keep that promise, and the blue package was simply the first place a shopper could see it. By the account that has come down, which is better treated as reported than as documented, the Umbrella Girl was not the agency's leading idea. She is described as having been among a set of alternatives, spotted and chosen by Sterling Morton, Joy's son, who was then the company secretary. The artist who drew her is not named in the surviving sources. She has been redrawn at least 5 times, in 1921, 1933, 1941, 1956, and 1968, with a further refresh around her centenary. Her hair changes, her hemline moves, her face is redrawn. The umbrella stays, the salt keeps spilling. The company is explicit, and has been for years, that she was never modeled on a real child. There is no girl. There is no family story, no photograph, no name in a ledger. She is a drawing made to sell a chemical improvement in a package, and she is very likely the single most durable thing anyone connected with this family ever produced. I have thought about why that campaign worked as well as it did, and the answer is probably the sentence rather than the picture. When it rains, it pours was already an English expression, meaning that misfortune arrives all at once, and the advertisement takes that phrase and turns it into a plain statement of product performance. In wet weather, this salt still comes out of the container. The line is doing 2 jobs in 7 words, and it never has to explain either of them. There is one more thing the campaign quietly accomplished. Salt had always been sold as a raw material, something a household bought the way it bought flour or coal, by weight and without much thought. The Umbrella Girl sells it as a domestic good associated with a child, a rainy afternoon, a kitchen. Nothing about the chemical changed. What changed was the category it occupied in a shopper's mind, from supply to household staple. And staples are bought without deliberation, again and again, for a lifetime. The slogan outgrew the company almost immediately. People now say it, constantly, with no notion that they are quoting a salt advertisement from 1914, and often meaning the original gloomy sense, naturally, than the commercial one. The company achieved the thing every advertiser says they want, which is complete absorption into ordinary speech. And the price of achieving it completely is that the achievement becomes invisible. By the standards of American trademarks, what happened here is close to the maximum available outcome. A commodity nobody could differentiate acquired a face and a phrase, and both of them outlived the men who commissioned them by a century. Still, none of it was the most consequential decision the company would ever make. That one came 10 years later, and it had nothing to do with selling anything. Subscribing is how work like this keeps reaching you, and it does not cost you a thing. Chapter 5. The Goiter Belt. Across a wide band of the United States, running through the upper Midwest and the Great Lakes states, and up into the Pacific Northwest, the soil is poor in iodine. Crops grown in it are poor in iodine. People who ate mostly what was grown near them, which in the 19th and early 20th centuries meant nearly everyone, took in very little of it. The thyroid gland, starved of the element it requires, swells. The result is a goiter, and in the affected region it was ordinary, visible, and common enough to be unremarkable. The region acquired a name in the medical literature, the goiter belt. It is easy to read that as a statistic and miss what it described. A goiter is a swelling at the front of the throat, and a large one is not subtle. It can press on the windpipe and make breathing difficult and change the voice. In children, iodine deficiency does considerably worse than that, because the thyroid governs development, and severe deficiency in early life produces permanent damage to growth and to the mind. This was ordinary across a wide band of the country. It was common enough in places that it was not remarked on, the way any condition becomes invisible when a third of the room has it. The scale of it became difficult to ignore during the First World War, when men were examined for the draft and the examinations produced records. In parts of the affected states, the rate of enlarged thyroids among young men was high enough to become a matter of public discussion. A survey of Michigan school children carried out in 1924 found goiter in 38.6% of those examined. That is a documented figure, and it is the one I would rely on. Higher figures circulate for the region, and I have not been able to verify them well enough to use. By then, the science had already been done. David Marine had run trials in Akron, Ohio, in the years around 1917 to 1922, showing that iodine supplementation prevented goiter in school children. Switzerland had begun iodizing salt. In Michigan, a University of Michigan pediatrician named David Murray Cowie took up the argument that the American solution ought to be the Swiss one, and that the vehicle ought to be table salt, because table salt was the one thing that entered every household in the country, regardless of income, region, or literacy. The first iodized salt went onto Michigan shelves on the 1st of May, 1924. Morton's position at that moment deserves to be stated carefully, because it is the most creditable thing in this entire account, and it is almost entirely forgotten. The company was, by then, the dominant national brand. It had spent a decade and a great deal of money teaching the country that its blue package meant reliable salt. It was now being asked to alter the contents of that package, nationally, on the recommendation of physicians, for a condition that its customers outside the affected region did not have and had no reason to care about. Changing a national product formula is the sort of decision that destroys brands. The company hesitated, which is not surprising. Then, in the autumn of 1924, it went ahead and became the first company to distribute iodized salt across the United States. Within roughly a decade, Iodized salt accounted for the overwhelming majority of table salt sold in the country. The Michigan schoolchildren surveyed at 38.6% in 1924 were surveyed again in 1951. The figure had fallen to 1.4%. An entire category of visible human suffering simply went away. No campaign announced it. No one was made to comply. A condition that had been a permanent feature of life across a third of the country receded, and it went away because a commodity everyone already bought had something added to it at the factory. No law compelled this, no mandate, no federal program, no penalty for refusing. A private company changed its formula, and the country's health changed with it. This may well be the most consequential thing the Mortons ever did. Almost nobody remembers it. The girl with the umbrella is on the box. The iodine is in the salt, invisible, unmentioned by almost everyone who eats it, having quietly done more measurable good than the advertisement and the fortune combined. It is a family pattern that will repeat. The things they gave away outlast the things they kept, and nobody attaches their name to the gift. And at the very moment the company was making that decision, the man who had built it was spending his last years 24 miles west of Chicago, buying farmland and putting trees in it. Chapter 6. Thornhill. The land Joy Morton began buying around 1909 sits in DuPage County, west of Chicago, near the village of Lyle. It was farm country then, low rolling ground above the east branch of the DuPage River, and he assembled something on the order of 1,900 acres of it. He built a house there and called the place Thornhill. He was in his 50s, running the largest salt company in the country, and what he did with his weekends and eventually with the bulk of his remaining life was plant trees on it. He did not do this casually. He wrote to Charles Sprague Sargent, who ran the Morton Arboretum at Harvard and was the most serious man in America on the subject, and asked how it ought to be done. He engaged O.C. Simons, a landscape designer of standing, to lay the ground out. The intention from early on was a collection rather than a private park, organized and labeled and studied, holding the trees that would grow in that climate for the public and for science. On the 14th of December, 1922, he formally established the Morton Arboretum, with an initial gift of roughly 400 acres out of his own land and a trust fund to keep it running. He was 67 years old. He also kept working. This was not a retirement project undertaken by a man who had handed the business to somebody else. He remained chairman of the salt company while the arboretum was being laid out, and the two enterprises ran side by side for the last 12 years of his life, one of them extracting a mineral from the ground on a continental scale, and the other putting things into the ground a few dozen miles from the company's own Chicago operations. The place grew quickly. By his death, it held 735 acres, and it has gone on growing since to the 1,700 it covers today. It is worth being precise about what an arboretum is, because the word sounds like a synonym for a park and is not one. A park is arranged for the people in it. An arboretum is arranged for the trees and for the study of them. Specimens are acquired deliberately, often from expeditions or exchanges with other institutions, and planted in groupings that let a person compare related species standing side by side. Each one is catalogued, its origin recorded, its performance in that soil and that climate watched across decades. The collection at Lyle today runs to something on the order of 222,000 plants, representing roughly 4,100 kinds of trees, with 16 miles of trail through it and a research operation attached. What Joy Morton set up in 1922 was a scientific instrument that happens to be beautiful, and it was designed to produce knowledge on a timescale no individual could live to see the end of. He was applying, on a great deal of money, exactly the proposition his father had spent a career arguing in a Nebraska newspaper. Set that beside what he did in Nebraska. In 1923, the year after founding the Arboretum, he handed Arbor Lodge and its grounds to the state. That was the family seat, the 52-room house outside Nebraska City, the place his father had built up from a frame cottage and come home to from the cabinet. He gave it away. It is a state park. I have gone looking, in the way you do with families like this, for the countermove. There is usually one. A man who gives away land and houses on that scale generally builds an equally careful structure to keep the valuable thing, the business, tied to his descendants in perpetuity. A holding company. A voting trust. A share class that carries 10 votes to everyone else's 1. Some instrument that says the family may sell the mansion, but will always control the company. I have not been able to find one. No family trust holding the shares, no dual-class structure, no mechanism at all, so far as the public record shows, designed to keep Morton Salt in Morton hands after the men who built it were gone. Whether that was a philosophy or simply an absence of foresight is not something the record settles, and claiming to know would be inventing. What I can say is that the pattern is consistent across 3 generations. The things this family gave away, they gave away permanently and with legal care. The thing they owned, they left loose. Joy Morton died on the 10th of May, 1934, at Thornhill, at the age of 78. He was buried on the grounds, in a small family cemetery among the trees he had planted, which is where he remains. His daughter, Jean Morton Cudahy, took over as chair of the Arboretum's trustees and held it for roughly 19 years. There is something fitting in the burial arrangement that I doubt was accidental. Most industrialists of that generation are in city cemeteries under substantial stone, in the company of other wealthy dead. Joy Morton is in the ground inside his own collection, and the things planted around him have gone on growing for more than 90 years since, which means the memorial keeps changing and getting larger, and was never finished on the day of the funeral. It is the only kind of monument that behaves the way its owner apparently thought about time. The salt company went on without him, and it went on from that point largely without Morton's at the top of it. Subscribing is how work like this keeps reaching people, and it is free. Chapter 7. The Quantity Discount. Daniel Peterkin was not a Morton. He was an executive Joy Morton had identified early, trained, trusted, and eventually given a minority ownership stake. And in 1930, he became president of the Morton Salt Company, while the founder stayed on as chairman. That is a small line in a corporate history, and it is the hinge of this entire account. 4 years before he died, the founder handed daily command of the company to a man from outside the family, and it never came back in any lasting way. Peterkin's son would later hold the presidency as well, which is worth noting because it means there was a family succession at the top of Morton Salt across 2 generations. It simply was not the Morton family. The men who inherited daily command of the company were Peterkins, and the arrangement seems to have been made deliberately by the founder, who had brought Daniel Peterkin along for years and given him an ownership stake rather than reserving the position for a son. The company he handed over was doing very well. It had the mines, the boats, the national brand, the iodine, and a product that every household and every food processor in the country had to buy in every economic condition. Depression or boom, people salt their food. The volumes barely move. The money arrives anyway. By the standards of American antitrust law, A business in that position eventually attracts attention, and in the 1940s, it did. The case is Federal Trade Commission against Morton Salt Company, and the Supreme Court decided it on the 3rd of May, 1948. The facts are almost comically mundane. Morton sold its table salt on a quantity discount schedule, which is to say, the more you bought, the less you paid per case. That is, ordinary commerce. The problem was the shape of the schedule. To reach the lowest price on the list, a buyer had to purchase salt in volumes that, in practice, only about 5 companies in the United States could manage. So those 5 bought at a price no one else could reach and could then sell salt at retail more cheaply than their smaller competitors could buy it at wholesale. Federal regulators found that this violated the law against price discrimination and ordered the company to stop. The Supreme Court agreed. The reasoning is the part that lasted. A discount schedule that is theoretically open to everyone, but practically available to almost no one, is still discrimination. The court held that the Commission did not need to prove that competition had actually been damaged, only that there was a reasonable possibility it might be, and it placed the burden of justifying the discount on the seller rather than on the government. Antitrust lawyers have been citing that ever since, and they cite it by name. It is called the Morton Salt Inference. The practical effect was considerable. A rule that lets a regulator infer harm to competition from the pattern of the pricing itself, without having to demonstrate a specific injured competitor, is a much easier rule to enforce than one that does not. It shaped how large sellers built their discount schedules for decades afterward, and it remains live law. The Federal Trade Commission has invoked the doctrine in price discrimination matters in recent years, and the inference can be rebutted, but the burden sits where the 1948 decision put it. There is something worth sitting with there. The family name entered the permanent legal vocabulary of the United States in 1948, in a case about the price of salt in boxes, and it is still in active use in Federal Trade Commission proceedings in this decade. It is one of the most durable things attached to the name. It is also, by then, referring to a company the family was in the process of leaving. It is also worth noticing what the case says about the company's position in 1948. A firm only ends up in that kind of litigation if it is large enough that its pricing schedule shapes an entire market, and the specific complaint that only about 5 buyers in the United States could purchase at the volumes required to reach the bottom price is itself a description of dominance. The government was arguing less that Morton had done something unusual than that Morton had become big enough for the ordinary thing to be a problem. Sterling Morton, Joy's son, who had chosen the girl with the umbrella when he was company secretary, served as president and then as chairman of the board. He died in 1961. He endowed a wing at the Art Institute of Chicago, which bears the family name, and he had chaired the Arboretum's trustees as well. After his death, the record goes quiet. Searching the leadership of the company from that point forward, through the mergers and the name changes and the sales, turns up no Morton at all. Descendants may well have held shares, and that cannot be ruled out from the public record, but no Morton appears to have run the salt company again. The founder had been dead 27 years. The name stayed on the box. What happens next is what happens to any well-run, cash-generating, dependable company that nobody in particular is holding on to. Chapter 8. The Boosters. In 1965, the business went public, and a company that had been a Chicago family concern for 80 years became a set of shares that anybody could buy. That change matters more than it sounds. A private family firm answers to the family. A public company answers to shareholders who are entitled to ask, every quarter, whether the assets they own are being used as productively as possible. A salt business generates cash reliably and grows slowly, which is a wonderful thing to own privately and an awkward thing to justify publicly, because the cash sitting on the balance sheet always looks like it could be doing more somewhere else. From 1965 onward, the company was under permanent pressure to be more than salt. What follows reads, at a distance, like a series of attempts to be something other than a salt company. In 1969, Morton merged with Norwich Pharmacal, the maker of consumer medicines, producing an entity called Morton Norwich Products. That combination did not work particularly well. A salt business, however dependable, does not throw off the kind of research budget a pharmaceutical business needs, and the drug side was starved for it. So in 1982, the company merged again, and this is where the name goes somewhere no one could have predicted. The partner was Thiokol, a chemical firm whose principal business was solid rocket propellant, and which held a very large share of that market in the United States. The merged company was called Morton Thiokol. The consequence of that name for 7 years was that the word Morton was on the solid rocket boosters of the American Space Shuttle. On the 28th of January, 1986, the shuttle Challenger broke apart shortly after launch. 7 people were killed. They were Francis Scobie, the commander, Michael Smith, the pilot, the mission specialists Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, and Ellison Onizuka, and the payload specialists Gregory Jarvis and Sharon Krista McAuliffe, a schoolteacher from New Hampshire who had been selected to teach lessons from orbit. The Presidential Commission, chaired by William Rogers, reported on the 9th of June that year. The cause was a failure in a joint of the right solid rocket booster, where rubber O-rings were supposed to seal the segments and did not, in temperatures far colder than anything the joint had been flown in before. What makes any of this belong in an account of a salt family is what had happened inside the contractor beforehand. On the 31st of July, 1985, roughly 6 months before the launch, a Morton Thiokol engineer named Roger Boisjoli had written to the company's vice president of engineering, warning that erosion of the O-ring seals was a genuine danger, and that the consequence, if the joint failed, would be catastrophic and would cost lives. He was specific, he was in writing, he was ignored. The engineering concern was specific rather than general. The joints between the segments of the booster were sealed by rubber rings, and rubber stiffens as it gets cold. A stiff seal seats more slowly against the pressure of ignition. The launch that morning followed an overnight freeze, well below anything in the flight history of that hardware. On the night before the launch, engineers at the company argued against flying in the cold. Alan MacDonald, who directed the booster project, refused to sign the recommendation to launch. A superior signed it instead. The company's management, after discussion, gave its approval anyway. Both men later told the Rogers Commission what had happened, and both paid a professional price for it before eventually being vindicated. Care is owed here, because this is neither my subject nor mine to dramatize. 7 people went to work and did not come home, and a great many of the details belong to their families, rather than to anyone making a documentary. What belongs in this account is narrower and stranger. A company that existed because a young man in 1880 bought a share of a Chicago salt agency had, a century later, its name attached to the worst day in the history of American spaceflight, through a merger made for reasons of corporate finance by people who had never met him. There was a second and less remembered loss during those years. In December of 1987, by the accounts on record, an explosion at a company plant producing propellant for the MX missile program killed 5 employees. The aerospace side of the business was, by its nature, dangerous work. In 1989, the arrangement was undone. The company split in 2. Thiokol went its own way with the aerospace business, and Morton International kept the salt and the specialty chemicals, and for a while, a large business making automobile airbags. If you have come this far, this is plainly the sort of thing you want more of. Subscribing is how you make sure it keeps arriving. Chapter 9. The buyers. Before the sale, there was one more transformation. Through the late 1980s and 90s, the most valuable thing Morton International owned was arguably automotive airbags rather than salt, a business that had come across in the Thiokol combination and that grew enormously as airbags went from a luxury option to standard equipment to a legal requirement. In 1997, the company sold that business to Autoliv of Sweden, and what remained was salt and specialty chemicals. On the 1st of February 1999, Rome and Haas, a Philadelphia specialty chemicals company, announced it was acquiring Morton International. The figure most commonly reported, and the one the acquiring company used, is $4.9 billion in cash and stock. Some early wire coverage put it at $4.6 billion, plus the assumption of debt. The deal closed on the 21st of June that year. The premium offered to Morton shareholders was better than 40% over the share price of a few days before. 10 years later, it moved again. In April of 2009, Dow Chemical, which by then owned Rome and Haas, agreed to sell Morton Salt to K+S, a German company whose main business is potash and fertilizer. Company filings put the value at about $1.675 billion. That closed on the 1st of October 2009. Dow used a large part of the proceeds to pay down the loan it had taken to buy Rome and Haas in the first place, which is to say that Morton Salt was sold, in part, to service the debt from a transaction it had been swept up in. Then, in 2021, it moved again. Stone Canyon Industries, a private investment holding company, together with Kistner and Mark Dimitri, closed the acquisition of the K+S salt business in the Americas, including Morton, at an enterprise value of about $3.2 billion. The deal completed on the 30th of April. It is worth asking what each buyer actually wanted, because the answer is almost never the salt itself. Rome and Haas wanted the specialty chemicals business and got the salt along with it. Dow wanted Rome and Haas and sold the salt to help pay for it. K+S, already a producer of mined minerals, wanted a North American position. Stone Canyon, an investment holding company, wanted a business with dependable cash flows and a name every American recognizes. In 4 consecutive transactions, the salt was the part that came along, or the part that was sold off, or the part valued for the steadiness that had made Joy Morton rich in the first place. Drug maker, rocket propellant maker, specialty chemicals, German fertilizer, private investment, 5 owners in 50 years, and the blue box on the shelf did not change in any way a shopper would notice. What the company actually sells has changed considerably more than the package suggests. The table salt everyone pictures is a modest share of the business. Most of what the company moves is rock salt for winter roads. By the United States Geological Survey's figures, highway de-icing accounted for about 41% of American salt consumption in 2024, running roughly level with the chemical industry, and in the following year, the de-icing share fell to about 37%, while the chemical share rose above it. De-icing demand rises and falls with the weather, which is the one thing in this business nobody controls. The customers who matter most are not households. They are state highway departments and county garages and municipalities, buying in bulk on annual contracts in an industry with very few sellers. The economics of that trade are worth a moment because they are the opposite of the grocery business the brand was built on. Road salt is heavy, cheap by the ton, and expensive to move, which means the practical market for any given mine is whatever lies within economic trucking or barge distance of it. That geography, more than anything a marketing department does, determines who can bid on a county's winter contract. In a business where the product is identical and the transport is the real cost, the number of genuine competitors for any particular buyer is often very small. That structure has produced its own trouble. In 2015, Morton Salt and Cargill's de-icing business settled a suit brought by the Ohio Attorney General, alleging that they had rigged bids and divided the state's road salt business between them. The two companies paid a combined $11.5 million, with Morton's share reported at roughly $3.8 million. Both denied wrongdoing, and the settlement carried no admission of it. The road salt part is the most quietly interesting turn in the whole 140 years. The business Joy Morton built was about preserving food, which is what salt was for through all of human history until refrigeration. What the company mostly does now is dissolve ice on pavement so that cars can brake. The commodity did not change at all. The country around it changed, and the salt found the new job. And the new job, on one specific stretch of highway in DuPage County, Illinois, runs straight past the trees. Chapter 10. The Trees on Route 53. Suzette Morton Davidson was Joy Morton's granddaughter, and she chaired the board of the Morton Arboretum from 1961, the year her father died, until 1977. When she stepped down, the chairmanship passed to Charles Hafner III. That was the end of family leadership at the Arboretum, and as far as the record shows, the end of a Morton at the head of any institution carrying the name. Which means the accounting can be stated fairly simply. The Salt Company, the last Morton to run it, died in 1961, and the company has since passed through 5 sets of owners, none of whom have any connection to the family or to Chicago. The Arboretum. Family leadership ended in 1977, and it has been run by professionals ever since, which is what its founder intended. Arbor Lodge, the family seat in Nebraska, was handed to the state in 1923 and is a public park. The Chicago plant on Elston Avenue, with the rooftop sign that a generation of drivers on the Kennedy Expressway used as a landmark, was sold in 2017 and is now a music venue, with the sign kept and the Umbrella Girl still up there over the roof. There is one more absence worth recording, because it is the kind of thing that shows up only when you look for it. Great American industrial fortunes of that era generally produced a foundation, a permanent institution with the family name on the letterhead, dispensing money in perpetuity. Searching for the Morton equivalent turns up individual acts of giving rather than an ongoing family vehicle. Mark Morton left the bulk of his estate to charity. Sterling Morton endowed the museum wing. Joy Morton endowed the Arboretum. What is absent is the standing structure through which a family keeps deciding, generation after generation, what its money will do. Everything is still standing. None of it is theirs. Let me stop the chronology here because the chronology has run out of places to go. It would be easy to make this into a story about a family that lost something, or a lament for an America where companies stayed put and names meant ownership. That is not what the roadside in Lyle shows. What it shows is a family that was unusually good at making permanent things and unusually indifferent to holding on to them, and got, in the end, exactly the result that combination produces. What strikes me, coming back to it, is how much of what they built was designed from the start to be handed over. The trees were always going to belong to the public. Arbor Day was always going to belong to whoever wanted to plant something. The iodine was put in the salt with no patent on the idea, and no law requiring it, and no particular credit attached, and it went into the bodies of 2 or 3 generations of American children who never knew whose decision it had been. A family that thinks that way will leave a great deal behind. It will not leave a dynasty, because a dynasty is a thing you build by holding on. The list of what survived is strange and durable. A national holiday about planting trees, a drawing of a girl who never existed, and the sentence underneath her, which the country now says without knowing it is quoting an advertisement. A rule in the antitrust casebooks that lawyers still call by the family name. Iodine in the salt, and the goiter gone from the Midwest. 1,700 acres in DuPage County with more than 200,000 cataloged plants on it. What did not survive is the ownership. Not the company, not the mines, not the trademark, not the mansion, and not a single Morton anywhere in the leadership of any of it. Which brings it back to Illinois Route 53, in Lyle, on a February morning. The state truck goes past with the spreader turning, throwing rock salt in an arc across the lanes. The spray lifts and drifts east into the tree line, onto bark and buds and needles, and down into the ground at the shoulder. Inside the gate, the collection stands where he put it, labeled and catalogued and counted. The salt in that truck is his. The trees taking it are his. Both of those sentences are true, and neither of them has been true in any legal sense for a very long time. He has been dead since 1934, and the company that loaded the truck has changed hands repeatedly since anyone in his family had anything to do with it. And the researchers measuring the damage to the trees work for an institution he founded and gave away. Both sides of that road are still doing exactly what he set them up to do. Neither side belongs to him or to anyone descended from him. Nothing about that arrangement is going to change. Every winter the trucks go out. Every spring the Arboretum counts what the salt took. The name on the truck and the name on the gate are the same name, and it belongs now to no one at all. This is the kind of story this channel exists to tell. Subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.